I never thought a random knock on my door could unravel my perfectly guarded life. But there he was, a young, eager stranger holding a coffee maker and staring at the secrets I accidentally left on display. The shame of that moment should have made me crumble, but instead, it ignited something inside me I couldn't ignore. How could a single encounter flip my world upside down? Let me tell you. Brittany had always been a creature of habit. At 60 years old, divorced for over 15 years, she had carefully curated her life to avoid complications. Her days were predictable, her nights quiet. Loneliness was a constant, though she rarely admitted it. Her home, a modest but comfortable space, mirrored her life, tidy, controlled, and devoid of surprises. The walls held echoes of a life once shared, now filled with memories she tried not to revisit. Her routine provided a certain solace. Morning coffee brewed just right, afternoons spent gardening or reading, and evenings that often blurred into one another. Brittany wasn't unhappy, per se, but she wasn't fulfilled either. She filled the silence with small comforts, candles, soft music, and the occasional indulgence in her private moments. These personal items, scattered across her living room, were her quiet rebellion against the emptiness she tried to suppress. Jake entered her life on an unassuming Tuesday. She had gone to the store for a coffee maker, a simple errand. When the young man behind the counter offered to help deliver it to her house, she didn't think much of it. His name was Jake, 23 years old, bright-eyed, and brimming with enthusiasm. His energy was a stark contrast to the stillness that had taken root in her life. When Jake stepped into her home, Brittany's carefully constructed world began to shift. She noticed the way his eyes roamed her living room, landing on the items she had carelessly left out, a mix of toys and personal clothing. Her cheeks flushed as embarrassment washed over her. She hadn't planned for anyone to see this side of her. "I'm sorry, Jake," she stammered, trying to collect herself. "Let's just pretend you didn't see any of this." But Jake didn't laugh or judge. Instead, he smiled, his expression warm and understanding. "It's okay," he said gently. "Everyone has a part of themselves they keep hidden. It doesn't make you any less human." His words unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite define. For the first time in years, Brittany felt truly seen, not as a woman defined by her age or circumstance, but as someone with desires, flaws, and a heart that still longed for connection. In the days that followed Jake's visit, Brittany found herself replaying the encounter in her mind. His words lingered, stirring feelings she had long buried. She told herself it was silly, that he was just being polite. But the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, the way he seemed so at ease despite her flustered state, it all felt too real to ignore. Jake began stopping by more often, under the guise of helping her with small tasks around the house. He claimed he enjoyed their conversations, and Brittany, despite her initial hesitation, welcomed the company. Yet, with each visit, she couldn't shake the growing unease within her. It wasn't that she distrusted Jake, but there was something about his presence that made her question herself. Was she misreading his kindness? Or was there truly something unspoken simmering between them? One evening, as they sat in her living room sipping tea, Jake's phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table. Brittany tried not to glance at the screen, but the name flashing on it caught her attention. Lisa. The frequency of the messages, paired with Jake's quick effort to silence the phone, sent a pang of doubt through her. Was there someone else in his life? A girlfriend? A fiancé? She told herself it wasn't her business, but the thought gnawed at her. "Jake," she ventured cautiously, "you seem distracted tonight. Everything okay?" He looked up, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. "Yeah, just a friend," he said quickly, pocketing the phone. But the tightness in his smile didn't escape her notice. Later that night, as Brittany stood in her kitchen washing dishes, she couldn't help but wonder if she was setting herself up for disappointment. Jake was young, vibrant, and full of life. What could he possibly see in her? The idea of being vulnerable again terrified her, yet the connection she felt with Jake was undeniable. Her mind wandered back to the way he had looked at her that first day, the way his words had wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Could it have been genuine? The turning point came one afternoon when Jake arrived unannounced. Brittany had been folding laundry in the living room when she heard the knock. Opening the door, she found Jake standing there, his expression uncertain. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, holding up a small box of pastries. "I just thought you might like these." She hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. As he placed the box on the kitchen counter, his gaze landed on her once again. There was an intensity in his eyes that made her heart race. "Brittany," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" Her pulse quickened as she nodded. "Of course." "Do you ever get lonely?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in his question took her by surprise. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. How could she admit to the loneliness that had become a constant companion in her life? "Sometimes," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "But I've learned to live with it." Jake took a step closer, his expression earnest. "You don't have to," he said, his words laced with a quiet determination. "Not anymore." Brittany's breath caught in her throat. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken emotions. She could feel the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. But as much as she wanted to believe in the possibility of something real, a part of her still held back. Was Jake truly what he seemed, or was she allowing herself to be swept away by a fleeting fantasy? Brittany couldn't deny the shift between them. Jake's words that day lingered in her mind, replaying over and over like a song she couldn't forget. "You don't have to be lonely." The simplicity of the statement struck a chord deep within her, a longing she had hidden even from herself. But now, every glance, every word exchanged with Jake seemed to blur the boundaries she had once held so firmly. One evening, Jake stayed longer than usual. He had come over to help her organize the clutter in her garage, but by the time they finished, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. Brittany invited him inside for a drink, a simple gesture she told herself was innocent. As they sat in the dimly lit kitchen, sipping wine and sharing stories, the atmosphere began to change. Jake leaned back in his chair, his gaze resting on her as she spoke. "You know," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I've never met anyone like you. You're different." Brittany chuckled nervously, brushing off the compliment. "Different how?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You make me feel comfortable. Like I can just be myself around you." The sincerity in his tone made her heart ache. She looked away, unsure of how to respond. "That's kind of you to say," she murmured, trying to steady her breathing. But the way he looked at her made it impossible to ignore the tension that had been building between them. As the evening wore on, the space between them seemed to shrink. When Brittany stood to refill her glass, she felt Jake's gaze follow her, lingering in a way that made her pulse race. She returned to the table, but this time, instead of sitting across from him, she hesitated and then slid into the chair beside him. It was a subtle move, but it changed everything. "Brittany," Jake said suddenly, his voice low, "I need to ask you something." She turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" "Do you ever feel like," he trailed off, his cheeks flushing slightly, "like you're missing something in your life? Something you didn't realize you needed until it was right in front of you?" Her chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. She knew exactly what he meant, because she had been feeling the same thing. "I think we all feel that way sometimes," she replied cautiously. But her voice betrayed her, trembling under the weight of her own emotions. Jake reached out then, his hand brushing against hers on the table. It was such a small gesture, yet it sent a wave of electricity through her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers entwine with his, the warmth of his touch both comforting and exhilarating. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his eyes locking onto hers. "From the moment I first stepped into your house, I've felt something I can't explain. And I think, you feel it too." Brittany's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to deny it, to push him away and protect herself from the storm she knew was coming. But the truth was, she did feel it. Every time Jake looked at her, every time he smiled or spoke her name, she felt herself falling further into something she couldn't control. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then don't say anything," Jake said, leaning closer. His face was inches from hers now, and she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Just tell me if I'm wrong." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both hesitant and full of longing. It was the kind of kiss that seemed to stop time, a moment suspended between reality and the unknown. When they finally pulled apart, Brittany felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear. She knew they had crossed a line, but for the first time in years, she didn't care. Jake reached up to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch sending shivers down her spine. "You're incredible," he said softly, his eyes searching hers for any sign of regret. Brittany smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she shook her head. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. "But I don't want to stop." Jake leaned in again, his hands finding their way to her waist as he whispered, "Then don't." The rest of the night passed in a blur of stolen touches and whispered confessions. Every barrier Brittany had built around herself seemed to crumble as she allowed herself to feel, to connect, to be vulnerable. And Jake, with his youthful energy and unguarded honesty, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved this. As dawn began to break, Brittany lay awake beside him, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to answer. What would happen next? Could this really be something real, or was it destined to end in heartbreak? But for now, as Jake's arm draped protectively over her, she chose to live in the moment, letting herself bask in the warmth of his presence. Brittany had never woken up feeling quite like this. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Jake's arm was still draped over her waist, his breathing steady and peaceful. For a moment, she allowed herself to revel in the quiet intimacy of the moment. But reality soon crept in, bringing with it the weight of what had happened. Slipping out of bed as quietly as she could, Brittany wrapped herself in a robe and made her way to the kitchen. She needed time to think, to process the whirlwind of emotions that had engulfed her over the past few weeks. As she brewed coffee, the sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Jake stood in the doorway, his hair tousled and his expression unsure. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," Brittany replied, forcing a smile. She handed him a mug of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch was enough to send a jolt of electricity through her, but she quickly looked away. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his gaze searching hers. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just thinking." Jake took a sip of his coffee, his brow furrowing. "About us?" She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "This, whatever this is, it's complicated, Jake. I don't even know where to begin." "Then let's figure it out together," he said, stepping closer. "I don't care about the complications, Brittany. I care about you." His words were sincere, but they did little to ease the knot of anxiety in her chest. Before she could respond, the sound of a knock at the front door shattered the moment. Brittany froze, her heart racing. She wasn't expecting anyone. "I'll get it," she said quickly, setting her mug down and hurrying to the door. When she opened it, the sight that greeted her made her stomach drop. Standing on the porch was a young woman, no older than Jake, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Is Jake here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Brittany's mind raced. Who was this woman? A friend? A girlfriend? She turned to glance at Jake, who had followed her into the hallway. His face paled as his eyes met the woman's. "Lisa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa. The name she had seen flashing on his phone. Brittany felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. She stepped aside as Lisa pushed past her, her gaze fixed on Jake. "What's going on, Jake?" Lisa demanded, her tone sharp. "I haven't heard from you in days, and now I find you here. What are you doing?" Jake ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Lisa, I told you we're done. I've moved on." "Moved on?" Lisa's voice cracked with emotion. "To what?" "To her." She gestured toward Brittany, her eyes narrowing. "Are you serious?" Brittany felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but no words came. Jake stepped between them, his posture protective. "Lisa, stop," he said firmly. "You and I ended months ago. I'm not doing this with you anymore." Lisa's gaze flickered to Brittany, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into," she said coldly before turning on her heel and storming out. The door slammed shut, leaving Brittany and Jake in a tense silence. Brittany stared at him, her mind racing. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake sighed, running a hand over his face. "She's my ex. We broke up a while ago, but she hasn't let go. And you didn't think to tell me this before?" Brittany's voice rose, a mixture of hurt and anger bubbling to the surface. "I didn't think it mattered," Jake said defensively. "She's not part of my life anymore. But she clearly thinks she is." Brittany shot back. "Jake, this isn't just about her. It's about us. About what we're doing." Jake stepped closer, his expression softening. "Brittany, I know this is complicated, but I meant what I said. I care about you. I want this to work." She looked away, her emotions a tangled mess. "I don't know if I can do this, Jake. It's too much." Before he could respond, her phone buzzed on the counter. She grabbed it, eager for a distraction, but the message that appeared on the screen made her blood run cold. It was from a neighbor, someone she had known for years. "Brittany, I saw someone at your house last night. A young man. Is everything okay?" The realization hit her like a freight train. People had noticed. Her carefully constructed life, her quiet existence, it was unraveling. She turned to Jake, her eyes filled with panic. "You need to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Now. Brittany, please. Just go, Jake," she shouted, the weight of everything crashing down on her. Jake hesitated, his expression pained, but he nodded. He grabbed his coat and walked to the door, pausing for a moment before looking back at her. "I'll give you space," he said quietly. "But I'm not giving up on us." When the door closed behind him, Brittany collapsed onto the couch, her head in her hands. Tears streamed down her face as the reality of the situation sank in. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe in the possibility of something more, but now it felt like everything was falling apart. Hours passed as she sat in silence, replaying the events of the morning in her mind. She thought of Jake, of his sincerity and the connection they had shared. But she also thought of Lisa, of her neighbor's message, of the risks she had taken. Was it worth it? When the sun began to set, Brittany finally stood and made her way to the bedroom. The faint scent of Jake's cologne lingered in the air, a reminder of the moments they had shared. She sat on the edge of the bed, her heart heavy. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Jake's departure were a blur for Brittany. Her once quiet home now felt hollow, as if the absence of his presence had taken something vital with it. She tried to fill the void by throwing herself into mundane tasks, organizing the pantry, scrubbing the floors, even rearranging her bookshelves, but nothing could drown out the ache in her chest or the nagging whispers of regret. Her neighbor's message lingered in her mind like a storm cloud. She had always prided herself on her privacy, her ability to live her life without interference. But now, it was clear that her world had become the subject of scrutiny. The thought made her stomach churn. What had people seen? What were they saying? The walls of her sanctuary, once impenetrable, now felt paper-thin. One afternoon, while pruning her garden, Brittany noticed Mrs. Callahan from across the street watching her. The older woman's gaze was sharp, her lips pressed into a thin line. Brittany tried to ignore it, but the tension was suffocating. She hurried inside, her hands shaking as she locked the door behind her. The phone calls started soon after. A few were from friends, their voices laced with curiosity masked as concern. "Are you doing okay, Brittany?" they'd ask, their questions seemingly innocent but loaded with subtext. She brushed them off, offering vague reassurances, but each call left her feeling more exposed. Then there were the messages from Jake. At first, they were gentle, filled with concern and a longing to reconnect. "I just want to know you're okay. Please, can we talk?" But Brittany couldn't bring herself to respond. She read his texts over and over, her finger hovering over the reply button, but fear held her back. Fear of what people would think. Fear of being judged. Fear of opening her heart again, only to have it shattered. Lisa's sudden appearance had only added to the turmoil. Brittany couldn't shake the memory of the young woman's words, the way she had looked at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. She wondered if Lisa was right. Was this all a mistake? Was she foolish for believing she could have something real with someone so much younger? As the weeks went on, the weight of her isolation grew unbearable. She missed Jake, his laughter, his warmth, the way he made her feel seen. But the guilt was overwhelming. She had let herself cross a line, and now she was paying the price. One evening, as she sat on the couch staring at her untouched dinner, there was a knock at the door. Her heart leapt, and for a fleeting moment, she hoped it was Jake. But when she opened the door, she found Lisa standing there, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" Lisa asked, her voice softer than before. Brittany hesitated but eventually stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. They sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy. "I shouldn't have come here like that," Lisa began, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I was hurt and angry, and I took it out on you. I'm sorry." Brittany blinked, taken aback by the apology. I don't know what to say. I just wanted to understand," Lisa continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "Jake and I were together for a long time. Seeing him with someone else, especially someone older, it was a lot to process." Brittany swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said quietly. "Jake and it just happened." Lisa nodded, her gaze softening. "He's a good guy. And I think he really cares about you. But you have to be sure about this. People will talk. They already are." Brittany looked away, her chest tightening. "I don't know if I can handle that." Lisa stood, smoothing her hands over her jeans. "That's something only you can decide. But if you do care about him, don't let fear stop you. Jake deserves someone who's all in." When Lisa left, Brittany sat in silence, her mind racing. She replayed their conversation, Lisa's words echoing in her head. Could she really walk away from Jake? Or was she letting the fear of judgment control her? The next day, Brittany found herself standing outside Jake's apartment. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door. When he opened it, his expression shifted from surprise to cautious hope. "Brittany," he said softly. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep pretending I don't care about you." Jake stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to pretend. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in weeks, Brittany felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she was willing to take the risk. Together, they would face whatever came next, one step at a time. Brittany and Jake sat on the porch of her house, watching the sunset cast a golden hue over the neighborhood. The quiet moment between them was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions and events that had brought them to this point. For the first time in weeks, Brittany felt a sense of calm. The fear, the doubt, the judgment, it was all still there, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. She turned to Jake, who was sipping a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you think this is crazy?" she asked softly. Jake glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "Probably," he admitted. "But sometimes the best things in life are the ones that don't make sense." His words brought a faint smile to her face. She had spent so much of her life trying to control everything, to maintain order and avoid chaos. But with Jake, she had learned that life didn't always follow the rules. Sometimes, it was messy and complicated, and that was okay. Over the next few weeks, Brittany slowly started to let go of the fears that had held her back. She stopped worrying about the whispers from her neighbors, the disapproving looks from acquaintances, and the self-doubt that told her she didn't deserve this happiness. Instead, she focused on the connection she shared with Jake, a bond that had grown deeper with every conversation, every shared laugh, and every quiet moment spent together. It wasn't always easy. There were times when Brittany questioned herself, when she wondered if their relationship could withstand the scrutiny and the challenges. But Jake's unwavering support and kindness gave her strength. He never pressured her, never made her feel like she had to prove anything. He simply loved her for who she was, and that was enough. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jake took her hand in his. "Brittany," he said, his voice steady, "I know this hasn't been easy for you. And I know people might never understand what we have. But I don't care what anyone else thinks. You make me happy. That's all that matters." His words brought tears to her eyes. You make me happy too, she said, her voice trembling. More than I ever thought possible. In that moment, Brittany realized something profound. Life was too short to let fear dictate her choices. She had spent so many years holding herself back, convinced that she didn't deserve love or happiness. But Jake had shown her that it was never too late to start over, to take a chance and embrace the possibilities of the unknown. As their relationship deepened, Brittany found herself reflecting on the lessons she had learned. She realized that love didn't have to fit into a neat little box. It didn't have to follow society's expectations or conform to anyone else's idea of what was acceptable. True love was about connection, about seeing and accepting someone for who they truly were. And in loving Jake, she had also learned to love herself, to forgive her past mistakes, to embrace her imperfections, and to believe that she was worthy of happiness. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. On a quiet Sunday morning, as Brittany and Jake shared breakfast on the porch, she reached across the table to take his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Jake looked at her, his expression puzzled. "For what?" "For reminding me that life isn't over just because things didn't go the way I planned. For showing me that it's okay to take risks. And for being patient with me." Jake squeezed her hand, his smile warm. "You've done the same for me," he said. "And I wouldn't trade this for anything." As they sat there, surrounded by the beauty of the morning, Brittany felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, with Jake by her side. If you've ever found yourself at a crossroads between fear and love, what would you choose? Brittany and Jake's story reminds us that it's never too late to take a chance on happiness. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever defied the odds for love? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable stories like this. Trust me, the next one will leave you speechless.